The snow fell in suffocating flurries that bitter winter night, the kind of cold that seemed to freeze the very blood in one's veins. Eleanor Ashcombe lay trapped beneath the splintered remains of her carriage, her lace gown torn and soaked with frost, her breath hitching in the dark, and understood with a terrifying stillness that this was the end. It was the end of the masquerade, the end of the forged identities, and the end of a flight that had pushed her to the very edge of her sanity. She had been playing a dangerous game for 6 months. 6 months of hiding in the shadows of the Tun, of clutching a locket that held the ruin of a dukedom, and of waking every morning to the fear that the truth would finally catch her. 6 months of knowing that Lord Silas Vane would never cease his hunt until he had reclaimed the documents she held, papers that, if revealed, would strip her savior of his world and destroy her utterly. But as the heavy silence of the woods threatened to swallow her, a pair of strong, gloved hands suddenly gripped hers, pulling her back from the threshold of death and into a destiny she was never meant to survive. Before we get deep into the story, please hit the like and subscribe button and don't miss out on our interesting stories. Now let's get into the story. The heavy iron gates of Moorland Estate groaned open like the jaws of a predator, swallowing the carriage into a world of oppressive opulence. Inside the cabin, Eleanor Ashcombe sat paralyzed, her breath hitching as she looked across at Alastair Hawthorne, the Duke of Moorland. He was a man of rigid, unyielding honor, the kind of man who would be utterly destroyed if he knew the woman he had just pulled from the wreckage was the architect of his potential ruin. He had wrapped her in his own wool cloak, the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco acting as a sensory anchor even as her mind drifted toward the abyss of her own deception. As the carriage jolted over the cobblestones, Alastair reached out to steady her, his gloved hand covering hers. The contact sent a sharp, confusing spark of electricity through her that was as terrifying as it was intoxicating, a physical connection that felt like a betrayal of the secret she carried. Every act of Alastair's mercy felt like a lash against her conscience. He spoke with a commanding authority that suggested he would move heaven and earth to protect her, unaware that Eleanor was the daughter of his family's greatest rival, a woman hiding forged documents that could strip him of his title and his lands by dawn. As they stepped into the grand foyer, the escalation of her guilt reached a fever pitch. She was a cuckoo in his nest, a fugitive hiding in plain sight beneath the judgment of his ancestors' portraits. The intimacy of his care, the way he whispered that she was safe now, only tightened the noose around her heart. Just as a flicker of genuine hope began to bloom against her better judgment, a shadow moved in the gallery above. Eleanor looked up, her blood turning to ice as she caught the unmistakable, predatory glint of Lord Silas Vane watching them from the darkness. He leaned over the railing, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face as he raised a finger to his lips, silently signaling that he knew exactly what was hidden in the locket around her neck and that the price for his silence was about to become unthinkable. The air in the Duke's library was thick with the scent of old parchment and the dying embers of a fire that offered no warmth to Eleanor's freezing soul. Alastair stood by the window, his silhouette a towering monolith of power and unyielding duty. He spoke of the scandal Silas Vane was brewing, of the whispers already beginning to rot the foundations of her reputation, and then he delivered the blow that shattered her world, a proposal. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a strategic fortification. He offered her his name as a shield, unaware that the woman he was trying to save was the very Trojan horse designed to dismantle his legacy. The stakes escalated with every steady beat of his heart. If she refused, Silas would drag her to the gallows by midnight, but if she accepted, she was weaving a web of lies that would eventually strangle the man she was beginning to admire. Eleanor felt the heavy gold locket, the vessel of Alastair's ruin, burning against her skin like a brand as she whispered her consent. The moment her hand met his to seal the pact, the atmospheric weight of the room shifted from sanctuary to prison. By becoming the Duchess of Moorland, she was hiding in the most dangerous place on earth, the center of his life. As they walked toward the grand staircase to announce their union, the intimacy of his touch felt like a holy benediction she was destined to desecrate. Alastair's eyes held a burgeoning, terrifying devotion that made her stomach churn with a mixture of desire and soul-crushing guilt. She was now the most powerful woman in the county, yet she was a slave to a secret that grew heavier with every step she took beside him. The escalation reached a breaking point as they reached the landing. Alastair leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly promise of a future she didn't deserve, but before he could speak, a servant appeared, trembling, with a silver tray. Resting upon it was a single blood-red rose pinned with a note in Silas Vane's jagged, recognizable hand. Eleanor's breath hitched as she read the single line that turned her victory into ash. "The Duke's bed is wide enough for 3, Eleanor, you, your husband, and the truth that will hang you both by dawn." The iron knocker struck the front door like a rhythmic executioner's axe, the sound reverberating through the marble halls of Moorland and turning Eleanor's blood to ice. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her fingers instinctively clutching the cold gold locket at her throat, the weight of it feeling like a literal millstone. Down in the foyer, the heavy doors swung wide to admit Lord Silas Vane. He didn't enter so much as he invaded, his presence a dark, oily stain against the pristine elegance of Alastair's ancestral home. Alastair stepped forward, his greeting formal and rigid, unaware that he was welcoming a viper into the very heart of his sanctuary. The stakes escalated with every predatory step Silas took toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's pale face. He moved with a terrifying confidence, the smile on his face jagged and cruel, a silent promise of the carnage he intended to unleash. As Alastair turned to lead the way into the morning room, Silas lingered at the base of the stairs, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried only to Eleanor's ears. He didn't speak of pleasantries. He spoke of the forged Ashcombe lineage and the physical evidence he knew she carried against her skin. Every word was a calculated strike, stripping away her newfound sense of safety until she felt as exposed as she had been in the wreckage of the carriage. The atmospheric tension reached a fever pitch when Silas reached out, his hand ghosting near her throat, close enough for her to smell the rot of his ambition. "A lovely duchess you make, Eleanor," he hissed, his gaze dropping pointedly to the locket. "But a duke's crown is a heavy thing to wear when the head that bears it is destined for the traitor's block." Just then, Alastair called out for them to join him, his tone warm and unsuspecting, deepening the agony of Eleanor's guilt. But as she moved to follow, Silas leaned in one last time, his voice a jagged edge of pure malice. "I've sent a second letter, Eleanor. One that Alastair has already opened. If you want to know which secret I've chosen to reveal first, I suggest you look at the paper he's holding right now." The late afternoon sun bled across the moorland gardens, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for Eleanor as she sat upon the weathered stone bench. Beside her, Alastair was a pillar of deceptive calm, his presence radiating a heat that both anchored her and made her skin crawl with the fever of her own duplicity. Desperate to mask the tremors in her hands, she leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of surrender that Alastair mistook for burgeoning love. For a heartbeat, the scent of cedar and wood smoke clinging to his coat offered a glimpse of a life she could never truly own, a sanctuary of peace where the name Ashcombe was not a death warrant. But the escalation of her reality was relentless. As Alastair tilted his head to brush his temple against her hair, his touch was so reverent it felt like a brand. He spoke in low, gravelly tones of the future, of the legacy they would build together, and the heirs who would carry the Hawthorne name. Every word was a jagged blade turning in Eleanor's heart, for she was the very viper in his garden, the architect of a ruin that would see him stripped of the very land they walked upon. The gold locket at her throat, heavy with the forged documents of his destruction, throbbed against her pulse like a ticking clock. The intimacy was a suffocating shroud. Alastair reached down, taking her hand in his and squeezing it with a terrifying, absolute devotion that made her want to scream the truth just to end the agony of his kindness. He was a man who believed he had found a partner. She was a woman who knew she was his greatest threat. Just as she felt her resolve beginning to shatter under the weight of his gaze, a flash of steel caught her eye from the upper terrace. Silas Vane stood there, openly watching them, his hand resting conspicuously on the hilt of a ceremonial sword. He didn't look away. Instead, he pointed slowly to his own chest and then to a waiting rider at the estate gates, mouthed the word "tonight," and turned his back, leaving Eleanor to realize that the deadline had shifted and the final betrayal was no longer a matter of days, but mere hours. The grand halls of Moorland were no longer a sanctuary. They were a labyrinth of shadows and whispering ghosts. Eleanor moved with the desperate agility of a cornered animal, her bare feet silent on the cold marble as she navigated the darkness toward Alastair's private study. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight, the heavy tolls vibrating through her very bones like a countdown to her execution. Every creak of the settling floorboards sounded like a gunshot, a jagged escalation of terror that made her pulse thunder against the gold locket at her throat. She knew that Silas's messenger was waiting at the edge of the woods, and if she did not find and incinerate the forged lineage papers within the hour, the dawn would bring Alastair's total annihilation. Inside the study, The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the lingering warmth of the man she was about to betray to save. Her fingers fumbled with the hidden catch of the mahogany desk, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. Just as the secret compartment clicked open, revealing the wax-sealed envelope that held the power to strip Alistair of his world, a heavy footfall echoed just outside the door. The stakes spiked to a breaking point. She had the documents in her hand, but the handle of the door began to turn. Alistair stepped into the room, a single candle casting long, flickering shadows that danced like demons on the walls. Eleanor barely managed to slide the compartment shut, thrusting the papers into the folds of her nightgown as she spun around, her heart nearly bursting from her chest. He looked at her with such profound, unsuspecting tenderness that it felt like a physical blow to her soul. "Eleanor, I heard a noise," he murmured, stepping closer until the heat of his body was inches from her cold, trembling frame. He reached out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, his gaze filled with a terrifyingly absolute devotion. But as he pulled her into a protective embrace, his hand shifted, his fingers brushing against the sharp, telltale corner of the stolen documents hidden against her skin. Alistair's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp suspicion as he pulled back to look directly into her panicked eyes. "What?" he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly edge. "Are you hiding from me, Eleanor?" The morning light felt like a spotlight on a stage where Eleanor was the only actor left without a script. The study door had barely closed on Alistair's lingering suspicion when Silas Vane appeared in the conservatory, his presence a jagged blade cutting through the silence of the estate. He did not wait for pleasantries. Instead, he cornered Eleanor amidst the dying lilies, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger that suggested the hunt was nearing its end. He spoke of the Queen's court and the cold finality of the Tower, his voice a low, venomous hiss as he revealed his true gambit. He didn't just want the documents she had stolen. He wanted her to dismantle Alistair's legal estate defenses from the inside, leaving the Duke defenseless against a total takeover. The stakes escalated with every breath Eleanor drew. Silas held a letter, a forged account of her true, disgraced lineage, and threatened to place it directly into the Queen's hands by sunset if she did not deliver the master key to Alistair's vault. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs as she realized that to save Alistair's life, she would have to commit the ultimate act of treason against his heart. Every memory of the Duke's tenderness, every spark of attraction they had shared in the garden, was now a weapon Silas used to goad her into compliance. The atmosphere grew suffocatingly tense as Silas leaned in, the scent of expensive brandy and old malice cloying on his breath. "Imagine the look on his face, Eleanor," he whispered, "when he realizes his perfect Duchess was the one who handed him the quill to sign away his own soul." He checked his pocket watch, the ticking sounding like the beating of a drum. Just as Eleanor opened her mouth to defy him, the conservatory doors flew open. Alistair stood there, his face a mask of thunderous fury, holding a crumpled piece of parchment that Silas had intentionally left behind. But it wasn't the lineage papers. As Alistair's eyes locked onto Eleanor's, his hand trembled with a rage she had never seen, and he spoke 3 words that changed the game entirely. "He's already here." At that moment, the sound of royal trumpets blared at the estate gates. The Queen's herald had arrived 12 hours early. The night air was a suffocating velvet shroud, thick with the scent of ozone and the impending storm that mirrored the ruin of Eleanor's soul. Within the gilded walls of Moorland, time had become a distorted enemy, each tick of the grandfather clock striking like a hammer against her ribs. The Queen's heralds were already quartered in the East Wing, their presence a silent, terrifying reminder that the dawn was no longer a metaphor, it was a literal, ticking deadline. By sunrise, Silas Vane would present the forged evidence to the council, and the Hawthorne name would be erased from history as if it were a stain on a sleeve. The escalation of the evening reached a fever pitch as Eleanor stood by the window, watching the flickers of torches in the distance. Silas had cornered her in the gallery moments ago, his eyes dancing with a manic, triumphant light. He had given her one final, impossible choice: hand over the Duke's private seal to validate the treasonous documents, or watch Alistair be dragged to the Tower in chains before the morning mist had cleared. The stakes were no longer merely about a title or a fortune. They were about a man's life and the light in his eyes that Eleanor had come to crave more than her own breath. Alistair entered the bedchamber, his movements heavy with a weariness that broke Eleanor's heart. He walked to her, his hands settling on her waist with a desperate, grounding pressure. He spoke of the Queen's unexpected arrival not with fear for himself, but with a fierce, protective worry for her. "Whatever happens when the sun rises, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a gravelly vow of devotion, "I will ensure you are safe. They will have to tear my heart out before they touch a hair on your head." The irony was a jagged blade. He was ready to die for the woman who held the very dagger to his throat. As he pulled her into a final, suffocating embrace, the door to the chamber was suddenly kicked open. It wasn't Silas, but the Queen's royal guard, their steel breastplates gleaming in the candlelight. They didn't move toward Eleanor. Instead, they surrounded Alistair, their swords drawn with a lethal finality. The captain of the guard stepped forward, his face a mask of grim duty, and held up the gold locket Eleanor had hidden beneath her pillow. "Your Grace," the captain boomed, his gaze shifting from the Duke to Eleanor's ashen face, "by order of the Council, you are under arrest for high treason. And as for you, madam, the Queen has requested your presence for a very different reason." The air in the library was suffocating, thick with the scent of old leather and the metallic tang of betrayal. The royal guard stood like statues against the mahogany shelves, their drawn steel reflecting the flickering candlelight as the Duke was forced into the center of the room. Silas Vane sat behind Alistair's own desk, leaning back with a sickening air of ownership, the stolen gold locket dangling from his fingertips like a pendulum of doom. Eleanor stood trembling by the hearth, her world tilting on its axis as the captain of the guard laid the contents of the locket across the desk, the forged documents, the secret lineage, the cold evidence of her treachery. The escalation was brutal. Alistair's gaze moved from the papers to Eleanor, and for a heartbeat, the library was as silent as a tomb. "Is this why you were in my study?" he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp that cut deeper than any blade. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The woman he had shielded, the woman he had loved with a terrifyingly pure devotion, was the very architect of his ruin. The stakes reached a breaking point as Silas began to read the documents aloud, his voice dripping with venomous triumph, stripping Alistair of his name, his lands, and his honor in front of the Queen's own men. Every word was a lash. Eleanor watched the man she loved crumble from within, his pride withering as he realized he had been harboring his own executioner. "I did it to save you," she choked out, but the lie felt like ash in her mouth. The intimacy they had shared in the garden now felt like a fever dream, a hollow mockery of the truth. Alistair didn't shout. He simply looked at her with a hollow, dead expression that was far worse than rage. He was a duke no longer, and the woman who had caused his fall was the only person he had left. The tension peaked when Silas stood up, a dark smile twisting his lips. "But there is one thing the locket didn't reveal, Alistair," Silas hissed, stepping toward the Duke. He pulled a second blood-stained parchment from his vest, one that Eleanor had never seen. The forgery wasn't just Eleanor's doing. "Look at the signature on the original contract, Your Grace. Look at the name of the man who sold her to me." Alistair leaned in, his eyes widening in pure horror as he recognized the handwriting of the one person he trusted more than Eleanor, and as the realization struck, the library doors were barred from the outside, and the smell of smoke began to curl beneath the wood. The heat in the library rose to a blistering roar, the smell of charred oak and ancient parchment filling the lungs of those trapped within. Smoke billowed in thick, choking plumes, obscuring the faces of the royal guard who now panicked, realizing that Silas Vane's gambit included their own execution. Silas stood by the window, a silhouette of pure malice, watching the flames lick the heels of the man he had dismantled. Alistair clutched the blood-stained parchment, his eyes fixed on the signature of his own father, the revelation that his entire life was a lie, a debt paid in the currency of Eleanor's suffering. The stakes had reached their ultimate lethal apex. Stay and burn as a Duke of Nothing, or walk through the fire as a man with no name. Eleanor lunged through the smoke, her dress catching sparks as she reached for Alistair's hand. "Alistair, look at me!" she screamed over the roar of the collapsing ceiling. He turned, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to transcend the physical danger. In that moment of absolute ruin, the escalation of his love performed its final, desperate miracle. He didn't look at the crown on his signet ring or the burning legacy on the desk. He looked at the woman who had been both his poison and his only cure. With a roar of defiance that drowned out the crackle of the flames, Alistair threw the documents into the heart of the inferno. He chose the lie that felt like life over the truth that felt like death. He grabbed Eleanor, shielding her body with his own as he charged toward the barred doors. With the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but his soul, He broke through the wood, spilling them both onto the cold, dew-drenched grass just as the library windows exploded in a shower of glass. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bleeding gold over the ruins of Moorland. They stood together, breathless and blackened by soot, two ghosts amidst the ashes of a dynasty. Alistair turned to Eleanor, his gaze fiercer than it had ever been when he wore a title. "The Duke is dead," he whispered, pulling her into a bruising, desperate kiss. "There is only us." But as they turned to flee into the woods, a cold, familiar click echoed in the morning air. Silas Vane stood 20 paces away, his face half-burned, leveling a dueling pistol directly at Eleanor's heart. His finger tightened on the trigger, but his eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the rider galloping toward them from the main road, a rider wearing the black and gold livery of the Queen's secret inquisitors, carrying a black-sealed scroll that bore Eleanor's true, unedited name. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe. Click on to watch the next.